Just today, he's talked about war crimes, international law, who's breaking international law. Last time I checked, John is not a lawyer. The International Criminal Court has indicted Netanyahu and Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The former Jewish president of the tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda says Netanyahu should be indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So let's just, we're going to play the expert game. John's not an expert on genocide. The actual genocide experts, the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars says Gaza is a genocide. The leading Israeli scholars of the Holocaust, Omar Bartov-Brown, Amos Goldberg at Hebrew University, say Gaza is a genocide. John's not an expert on targeting terrorists. The guy who led the attack on ISIS, the American Master Sergeant Wes Bryant, has said John doesn't know what he's talking about. So let's not play this credentials game, because John will lose, just like Douglas did on the Rogan show.
In today's video, Mehdi Hasan absolutely destroys Mad John Spencer in a heated debate about Gaza and the Israel-Hamas war. From the start, Hasan dismantles the double standards around self-defense and holds Spencer accountable for his blatant dismissal of Palestinian civilian deaths. As Spencer tries to justify Israel's military actions, Hasan fires back with cold, hard facts about international law, occupation, and the horrifying scale of destruction in Gaza. This wasn't just a debate, it was a masterclass in moral clarity versus military spin. But let's dive in and watch how Mehdi Hasan shuts down Mad John Spencer in this heated debate.
Let's talk about substance. John said a year ago, we're close to winning. He talked about not being allowed into Rafah. Rafah has been destroyed. Have you looked at any pictures recently? It's flattened. You don't need to go there with the IDF to see that they flattened Rafah. They flattened most of Gaza, and they still have not won, quote unquote. It's absurd to say that Israel was held back. Is this the new stab in the back? This is the new bullshit defense. The former Israeli ambassador to the United States said recently, thank God Joe Biden was president while this was going on. He gave us everything we wanted. He never asked us to stop. He never asked for a ceasefire. America gave Israel everything it wanted, and they went ahead and decided to, you talk about killing Hamas commanders. They dropped two 2,000-pound bombs on October the 31st, 2023, on the Jabalia refugee camp, killing over 100 people to kill one guy, Ibrahim Biari, who wasn't even there, a Hamas commander. They killed over 100 people with two 2,000-pound bombs, which incinerate everyone within 100 square feet and damage everyone within 1,000 square feet. That is not targeted warfare. That is not proportionate. That is not legal. And we've seen that play out now over 20 months. And as you said at the start of the show, as I said, the dam is breaking. The Spanish Prime Minister has said Israel is a genocidal state. The Brits, the French, the Canadians that have backed everything Israel done, Britain continues to arm Israel, are saying this is intolerable. Donald Trump, as you've said, Piers, wants this done, wants this over, isn't a fan of Netanyahu. Not that I have any trust in Trump to do any of the right thing. And I think the reality is, look, everyone can see with their own eyes, there's no justification ever for starving people. Since March the 2nd, to not allow baby formula and diapers in, only a sociopath would support that. And John's very smart, he's very eloquent, he comes on here, he talks with stats, cites law. Back in Israel, the Israeli politicians and the Israeli journalists are saying openly genocidal things. They are saying everyone in Gaza is our enemy. They are saying we're to get rid of everyone from Gaza. They are saying Gazan babies are not innocent. That's what they say on Israeli television, if anyone bothers to watch.
Yeah, and actually, John, there was a piece in the Jewish News in the UK published yesterday, which was without a doubt the most critical piece I have read by a mainstream Jewish newspaper in this country ever. And it was very critical of the Israeli government and its strategy. So I think this idea that what they're doing, the government, has widespread support now from Israelis or Jewish people globally, I think is actually beginning to be proven wrong. I think there's a lot of uprisings now of people saying enough, because they can see there's no end game. No one really on the Israeli government side has explained what is going to happen when this war ends, or indeed what victory looks like. And I just don't understand it. I mean, look, you're a war expert. If you don't have a victory, what happens?
Now Spencer, the so-called war expert, might come armed with tactical jargon, but Mehdi comes armed with facts, legal precedent, and a growing international consensus that what's happening in Gaza is not just a war, but a human catastrophe. Let's be real, Mehdi's not making wild claims here. He's referencing actual genocide scholars, former war crimes judges, and even top Israeli historians who agree that the actions in Gaza cross into genocidal territory. And while Spencer tries to insist Israel is simply targeting terrorists, the brutal reality is different. Entire refugee camps being flattened to kill or miss one guy. That's not surgical. That's not proportional. That's a war crime. Mehdi also nails it when he points out that the US didn't hold Israel back at all. On the contrary, they backed this campaign to the hilt, and disposed precision, two 2,000-pound bombs dropped on a dense refugee camp to kill a commander who wasn't even there. Over 100 civilians died. That's not an expert strategy. That's mass death, and it's indefensible.
So you have continued war. So this is, I mean, there was a lot there that Mehdi talked about. And if you have to quote a master sergeant as your expert, as you're trying to say that I'm not an expert, or the other people that you list, while you're saying I'm not an expert,
he's the guy who literally, led the effort to kill ISIS.
Yeah.
But okay.
Don't interrupt me. I didn't interrupt you. But you're not an expert. Fine. I'm not an expert. Fine. But history, the military tactics, you say, Piers, what does victory look like?
Yeah.
Exactly the standards. Every hostage brought home. Hamas not in power, both military or political power in Gaza, and there's something else. Now you have actual, great, quote, Israeli press. That's the beauty of a free press. People can say what they want and get it published. You have people voting with their feet in Gaza right now saying, Hamas, we don't want Hamas. What you have, what victory looks like. Now I can tell you historically what it has ever looked like and what did it take to defeat another military. Take the Korean War. 2 million civilians died in the Korean War. 54,000 civilians a month for every month of that war. Do we call that a genocide? Do we call it illegal? No. Israel does follow the law of war and goes way beyond the legal obligations, like feeding the enemy's population, because as of right now, trucks are rolling in, even though they've tried to figure out a plan to get the food away from Hamas.
Bullshit. 5
and again,
trucks.
point the finger at Hamas, point the Mehdi, control yourself. Open the gate to Egypt, create the biggest displaced person camp just on the other side of the gate, and get the women, the children, and the elderly out of harm's way, and then destroy Hamas. That's victory, so that it never threatens Israel again. Go to Sir Andrew Roberts on the history of when you start a war, when you lose a war, you actually do lose the right to govern your population. You do lose the right to subjugate your population, because the billionaires in Qatar don't care how many people in Gaza are dying.
Piers called out something that's been brewing for months. Global Jewish communities, including prominent voices in Jewish media, are openly questioning the Israeli government's strategy in Gaza. This isn't fringe criticism anymore. It's coming from inside the house. And it's not just about compassion, it's about logic. What is the endgame here? What does victory actually look like if every solution just prolongs the suffering and chaos? Match John Spencer's response, filled with dramatic historical comparisons like the Korean War and vague definitions of victory, felt detached from reality. When he says every hostage returned, Hamas gone from power, he glosses over the fact that flattening Gaza and starving civilians isn't actually doing that. It's not even close, and if anything, it's breeding more instability and resentment. He claims trucks are rolling in with aid, but credible reporting, including from the UN and Human Rights Watch, shows that humanitarian aid is still being chalked off, with Israeli policy deliberately blocking food, fuel, and medical supplies. Even US officials have publicly pushed Israel to do more to facilitate aid. Spencer also drops the idea that Palestinians should just leave Gaza and go to Egypt, as if that's a neutral or humane solution. It's not. That's displacement. That's ethnic cleansing rhetoric, and people are right to be horrified by it.
Okay, Mehdi, final word to you.
I mean, look, we can argue about what victory looks like. We can also argue that a victory shouldn't involve a genocide, right? That's been my consistent position from the beginning. Don't kill civilians. Don't intentionally harm civilians. When the former head of the Israeli military, the former Israeli defense minister, not some lefty, not some anti-Semite, Moshe Yaalon says last week, we're doing ethnic cleansing. We're sending our soldiers to commit war crimes. We're losing touch with our Jewish values. That's what Moshe Yaalon, a hawk, the former head of the Israeli military, said last week. There's a reason he's saying that, and there's a reason John Spencer doesn't want to engage with that, because Israeli generals are saying it themselves. We've turned killing kids into a hobby. The world can see. I thought we're not interrupting, John. The world can see what Israel is doing. Israeli generals can see. And by the way, one last point. Please don't go and invoke Yemen to score your points. I think I've spoken and written more about Yemen than you ever have. People like you only ever come along and cite Yemen and Sudan to defend Israel. You don't actually give a shit about the people of Yemen and Sudan. Show me how many things you've written about Yemen and Sudan versus what I've written about Yemen and Sudan.
Okay.
I actually don't give a shit about you. I care about civilians.
Oh, control yourself, John.
Mehdi makes a critical point. Victory, however you define it, should never involve mass civilians, casualties, or the targeting of children. And when even Moshe Yaalon, the former Israeli defense minister and IDF chief of staff, not exactly a dove, says this is ethnic cleansing and that Israeli soldiers are being sent to commit war crimes, you have to pause. That's not a fringe opinion. That's a voice from inside the Israeli military establishment ringing the alarm. Spencer, instead of addressing those damning critiques, dodges, pivots, and tries to invoke Yemen and Sudan as rhetorical shields for Israeli actions. But Mehdi calls that out perfectly. People only bring up those countries when it's convenient, not because they genuinely care. And the record backs him up. Spencer hasn't spent years spotlighting the horrors in Yemen. Mehdi has. It's not whataboutism when Mehdi's consistency on human rights spans across conflicts. And let's be honest, the world can see what's happening in Gaza. The ICJ has ruled that there's a plausible case of genocide. Over 70% of deaths are women and children, mass starvation, attacks on hospitals, journalists being systemically targeted. These are not footnotes in war. These are war crimes. And simply shouting self-defense doesn't make them disappear. When someone like Mehdi points this out, calmly, passionately, and all a so-called expert can respond with is "I don't give an F about you," it says everything about who's arguing from emotion and who's standing on actual ground.
Pause. Are you getting tired of getting half the story from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite. How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, left, right, and center are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights into media bias and political trends. Stay informed, think for yourself, and check out ground news in the description down below.